welcome. Get comfortable, settle in, and let your shoulders soften. Tonight we're going to wander, slowly and quietly, through some of the strangest abandoned asylums left standing in the world, places people once filled with hope, and then left behind. There's nothing here to fear. Everyone who once lived in these halls has long since gone to rest, and we're only visiting their memory, gently, from a safe distance. So you can let your eyes close whenever you like. You don't have to follow every word. Just let my voice carry you, room by room, into sleep. Chapter 1. Waverly Hills. Let's begin in the hills above Louisville, Kentucky, on a quiet rise of land where the air has always moved a little cooler than the city below. Imagine the early years of the 20th century. The valley along the Ohio River is low and damp, and in the warm months a soft mist hangs over the water and settles into the streets. It is a pretty place, and a growing one, but it carries a quiet problem that no one quite knows how to solve. There is a sickness moving through the city, slow and patient, and it has been moving through cities like this one all over the world. People call it consumption because of the way it seems to consume a person from the inside, little by little. The doctors call it tuberculosis. And in those years, before the medicines we now take for granted, there was no cure for it at all. There was only air and rest and time and hope. You can picture how it spread. In the crowded parts of the city, families lived close together in small rooms, and the damp lowland air seemed to hold the sickness in place. Louisville sat in one of the worst spots in the whole country for it, and so the people of the city looked up, away from the river, to the high wooded hills, where the wind was clean and the air was dry, and they thought, perhaps up there. Away from all of this, the sick could finally breathe. That was the whole idea behind a sanatorium. It wasn't a hospital in the way we think of one now, with bright lights and quick cures. It was closer to a refuge, a place where someone with weak lungs could go to live, sometimes for months, sometimes for years, surrounded by fresh air and rest and routine, giving the body its best possible chance to heal itself. The treatment was simple, almost gentle. Lie still. Breathe deeply. Spend hours on an open porch wrapped in blankets, even in winter, letting the cold, clean air wash through you. Eat well. Sleep often. And wait. So in 1910, on that high hill south of the city, a small wooden building opened its doors. It was modest at first, just 2 stories, meant to hold a few dozen patients. They named it for the hills around it, and for a nearby school whose teacher had loved the gentle, rolling waves of the land. Waverly Hills. It's a soft name, isn't it? It sounds like a place you might go to feel better. And for a while, that's exactly what it was. Let's rest here a moment, in those early years, before the building grew into the great looming structure most people picture. Picture the first patients arriving by the slow road up the hill, looking out over the trees, breathing that cooler air, perhaps feeling a small flicker of hope for the first time in a long while. Picture the long open porches, the rows of beds rolled out into the morning light, the blankets, the quiet. It was a hard sickness, and many would not recover. But the place itself, in the beginning, was built entirely around the idea of comfort, of giving rest. That's worth holding on to as we go. Let's stay a little longer in those gentler years, because the daily rhythm of the place is a soothing thing to imagine. A day at the sanatorium moved slowly, by design. There was no rushing here. Rushing was the enemy of the cure. The mornings began softly, with the windows already open to the cool hill air, and the patients were woken not to work but to rest, which is a strange and lovely idea when you sit with it. Their whole task, their only job, was to lie still and breathe and let their bodies mend. Nurses moved quietly down the long wards, taking temperatures, adjusting blankets, opening curtains to let in the pale early light. Breakfast was brought to those too weak to rise, and it was generous, for good food was considered part of the medicine. Milk, eggs, bread, butter, as much as a person could take, because the doctors believed that building up the body's strength gave it the best chance to win its quiet war. And then came the heart of the day, the rest cure itself. The patients were wheeled or walked out onto the great open porches, the solariums, where row upon row of beds and reclining chairs faced out into the open air. There they would lie, wrapped warmly, for hours at a time, simply breathing, simply being still, looking out over the trees and the rolling hills. In summer, the air was warm and full of birdsong and the smell of the woods. In winter, astonishingly to us now, they stayed out there still, bundled deep in blankets while snow fell beyond the eaves. Because the cold, clean air was thought to be the most healing air of all. Imagine lying there in the hush of a winter afternoon, snow drifting silently past the open edge of the porch, the whole world white and quiet, your only duty to breathe and rest. There is something almost beautiful in it. The children had their own place in this world, and that is the tenderest part. Tuberculosis spared no one by age, and so there were young ones at Waverly Hills too, kept in their own wards and given their own gentle routines, their lessons and their games fitted carefully around the long hours of required rest. The nurses grew close to them, as nurses do, and the staff themselves often lived right there on the hill, in their own quarters. For the work demanded long hours and the place was a world of its own, set apart from the city below. They gave their days to the care of strangers, year after year, in the shadow of a sickness that could take them too. We can hold them gently in our minds as well, those quiet caregivers, doing patient work in a hard time. So let's rest here, in the hush of one of those long afternoons, the rows of beds on the open porch, the blankets, the cool air moving through, the slow, slow rhythm of a place built entirely around the idea of stillness. Whatever came later, this was real too, and it was kind. The sickness, though, kept spreading. The little wooden building filled quickly, and then overflowed. Louisville's tuberculosis problem was simply too large for it, and so the decision was made to build something far greater. Through the early 1920s, on that same hill, workers raised an enormous new hospital, 5 stories of pale brick and stone, long and grand and a little severe, with great open-air solariums running along its sides so that hundreds of patients at once could be wheeled out into the sun and the wind. It opened in 1926, and for its time it was considered one of the most modern and advanced tuberculosis hospitals anywhere in the country. You can imagine it on its first days. The clean new halls, the smell of fresh paint and fresh linen, the wide windows, the nurses moving softly between the beds. Hundreds of people came to live there, to take the rest cure, to wait out their sickness in the high, clean air. Many of them were young. Tuberculosis took the young as readily as the old, and the wards held children as well as grandparents, all of them simply trying to breathe. The treatments of that era were a strange mixture. Some were as gentle as the place itself, sunlight therapy, where patients lay in the rays of the sun on the solarium porches, because doctors believed the light itself could help heal the lungs. Long hours of rest, good food, plenty of it. Fresh air around the clock, the windows kept open even when snow drifted onto the floors. These were the soft treatments, and they did help some people. The body, given enough rest and enough good air, can sometimes win the fight on its own. But there were harder treatments too, for the most serious cases, and here I'll go gently, because it's not a pleasant part of the story and we don't need to linger. When the rest cure wasn't enough, the doctors of that time tried surgeries that were difficult and often painful, attempts to give the diseased lungs a chance to rest by reducing the work they had to do. These were the best ideas medicine had at the time, before antibiotics existed. The people who performed them were trying to save lives with the tools they had. Many of those tools, by today's standards, were crude. We can simply acknowledge that, quietly, and let it pass. The important thing is this: every one of those people, the patients and the doctors and the nurses, is long gone now. Long at rest, far beyond any pain. We're only looking back at them with kindness. Now, here is where the legend of Waverly Hills begins to grow, And here is where we have to be honest with each other, the way we always are on these quiet nights. Because so many people were sick, and because tuberculosis was so deadly in those years, a great many patients did not leave the hill alive. And the hospital, it said, did not want the living patients to see the dead being carried out the front, day after day, for fear it would crush whatever hope kept them going. So a tunnel was built into the hillside, a long sloping passage that ran from the hospital down to the bottom of the hill, near the road. Supplies and workers could come up through it, out of the weather, and it could also be used, quietly, to bring the dead down and away, out of sight of the windows above. Over the years, in the retelling, that tunnel grew darker and stranger in people's imaginations. It came to be called the body chute, or the death tunnel, and around it gathered all sorts of stories and enormous, frightening numbers. Claims that tens of thousands of people had died on that hill. The truth is gentler and sadder and more ordinary than the legend. Yes, the tunnel existed, and yes, it was used to move the dead away with discretion and dignity, to spare the living. But the staggering numbers you sometimes hear are almost certainly inflated, grown larger with each retelling, the way these stories always do. The real toll, while real and while sorrowful, was nowhere near the figures the legend likes to whisper. So let's set those frightening numbers down. They aren't ours to carry tonight. Let's rest here for a breath. The hill, the cool air, the long porches catching the last of the evening light. So many quiet lives pass through this place. We can remember them softly. In time, the thing that finally emptied Waverly Hills was not a tragedy at all. It was a triumph. In the years after the Second World War, scientists discovered antibiotics that could actually cure tuberculosis. Medicines like streptomycin arrived, and almost overnight, the Great White Plague that had haunted the world for centuries began to retreat. People no longer needed to climb a hill and wait for months in the open air, hoping their bodies might win. They could simply take the medicine and recover. And so, one by one, the great sanatoriums of the world began to empty. There was no longer any reason for them to exist. In 1961, Waverly Hills closed its doors as a tuberculosis hospital. It's worth pausing on that, because it's such a quietly remarkable thing. All across the world, in those same years, the great tuberculosis sanatoriums were going dark, one after another, for the happiest possible reason. For half a century and more, these enormous, hopeful buildings had stood on their hills and in their forests, full of the sick and the resting and the patiently waiting. They had been among the largest and most modern hospitals of their age, whole institutions built around a single terrible disease. And then, almost in the space of a single generation, the medicine arrived that made all of them unnecessary. The sick no longer needed the hill, or the porch, or the long months of rest and air. They could be cured, simply and reliably, and sent home. And so these vast places, built at such expense and such hope, suddenly had no patience, no purpose, nothing left to do. They had, in the best possible way, worked themselves out of existence. The thing they were built to fight had been beaten. There is something almost moving in the idea of a building made obsolete by good news. We so often think of abandonment as sad, and much of it is. But the emptying of the great sanatoriums was, at its root, a victory, one of the quiet triumphs of the last century, written in empty wards and silent porches all over the world. Every dark window in every abandoned sanatorium is, in a way, a small monument to the day the cure arrived. The sickness it had been built to fight had, in a sense, been defeated. The building did not sit empty just yet. It reopened as a nursing home, caring for the elderly, for another 20 years or so, until it closed for good in the early 1980s, amid concerns about the care being given there. And then, at last, the great pale building on the hill fell silent. What followed is the long, slow chapter that comes to so many of these places. The emptiness, the years of standing alone in the weather, paint curling from the walls, windows breaking, vines finding their way up the brick, trees pressing close around the edges of the grounds, the wind moving through the long-abandoned solariums where patients had once lain in the sun. People crept in, of course, drawn to the size and the silence and the stories, and the legends multiplied in the dark. Tales of a room on the 5th floor, of shadows that seemed to move on their own, of footsteps in the empty halls. Ghost hunters came with their cameras and their recorders, and the place became famous, one of the most talked about haunted buildings in all of America. And here, gently, is where I'll remind you of something, the way I always do. These are stories. They're the kind of stories that gather, naturally, around any large old building where many people lived and died, especially one that stood empty and dark for so long. People see shapes in shadows. The mind fills silence with whatever it expects to find. None of it has ever been shown to be anything more than the imagination doing what it does in the dark. There is nothing in those halls now, but dust and echoes and the long memory of the place. Nothing waiting, nothing watching, just an old building, sleeping on its hill. And the better news, the news worth drifting off on, is that Waverly Hills is no longer left to rot. In more recent years, new owners have taken on the enormous task of saving it, slowly restoring the old building room by room, repairing the roof, securing the walls, trying to honour what it was rather than let it crumble. People visit now, by daylight, to learn its real history, the history of the sickness and the rest cure and the quiet hope of those open porches. The place that was built to give comfort is being cared for again, and the hill itself, the land that held it all, has simply gone on being a hill. That's a comforting thing to remember. Long before the wooden sanatorium of 1910, before the great brick building of 1926, before the sickness and the cure and the long emptiness, this was just a wooded rise above a river valley, where the air ran cool and clean and the trees changed with the seasons. And that is what it is again now, in all the ways that matter. The trees still change, the cool air still moves up from the valley on summer evenings. The seasons still turn over the hill exactly as they did when the first hopeful patients climbed the road, looking up at the high clean air and daring to believe they might breathe again. Think of it across a year, now, in its quiet old age. In spring, the woods around the building green and soften, and the birds come back, and the long empty solariums fill with the sound of leaves. In summer, the warm air hums, and the great pale building stands among full green trees, its windows catching the long evening light. In autumn, the hillside turns gold and russet and falls slowly bare, the way it must have looked to so many patients, on so many porches, watching the year wind down. And in winter, the snow comes, just as it always did, drifting silent past the eaves where the beds once stood out in the cold, clean, healing air, settling soft and white over the whole quiet hill. That is the truest ending for Waverly Hills, gentler than any ghost story and far more real. A place built out of fear of a terrible sickness, a sickness we have since defeated, standing now in peace on its hill, cared for, remembered, harming no one, while the seasons turn over it as they have for more than 100 years. The fear that built it is gone from the world. The cure that emptied it changed everything, and the hill abides, patient and green and cool, holding the long soft memory of everyone who ever came there hoping to breathe. So let that be how you hold it as you drift. Not a place of dread. A high green hill under a changing sky, where frightened people once came seeking rest, and where, at last, rest is truly all that remains. So let's leave Waverly Hills the way we'd want to leave it. The hill in the soft last light, the cool clean air it was always known for, moving gently through the trees. All those patients, all those nurses, all those long ago mornings on the sunlit porches, all of it finished now, all of it peaceful. Everyone, long, long at rest. The building stands quiet on its hill, and the night settles over it, and there is nothing there but stillness. Rest now. We'll move on when you're ready, but there's no hurry at all. Chapter 2. Trans-Allegheny. Now let's travel north and east, into the green hills of West Virginia, to the little town of Weston, where one of the largest hand-cut stone buildings ever raised in North America still stands among the trees. To understand this place, we have to go back to a time when the world was just beginning to think differently about the people it had so often shut away. For most of human history, those who suffered from illnesses of the mind were treated terribly. They were hidden, chained, locked in poorhouses and prisons and cellars, kept out of sight. But in the middle of the 1800s, a new idea was spreading, a gentler idea, and it had a name. They called it moral treatment. The man whose name is most tied to that idea was a Philadelphia doctor named Thomas Story Kirkbride, and his belief, which seems so simple now, was almost revolutionary then. He believed that people suffering in their minds did not need to be punished or hidden. They needed the opposite. They needed beauty. They needed sunlight and fresh air and quiet and order and dignity. He believed that the very building a person was housed in could help to heal them if it were designed with care. So he laid out a plan, a specific shape for a hospital that came to be known as the Kirkbride Plan. A long central section with great wings stretching out on either side in a gentle staggered line, like wings spread wide, so that every single room could catch the sun and the breeze and a view of the gardens and the hills beyond. No one was to be buried in a dark interior. Everyone was to have light. You can already feel, can't you, how good the intention was? How hopeful. Picture the architect's drawing, the long elegant building set into the landscape, surrounded by farmland and gardens, designed from the ground up around the idea that a person in distress deserves a beautiful place to rest. That is how the asylum at Weston began. Not as a place of horror, but as a place built out of compassion, and out of one of the kindest ideas the medicine of that age ever had. They began building it in 1858, out of stone quarried nearby and cut by hand, block by block, much of the early labour done by immigrant masons from Ireland and Germany. Think of that labour for a moment, because it is its own quiet story. Stone does not become a building easily. Every block in those vast walls had to be cut from the earth, shaped by hand, hauled, lifted and set in place, one upon another, by men working with hammer and chisel and muscle through the heat of summer and the cold of winter. Many of them were newcomers to America, men from Ireland and from Germany, who had crossed an ocean looking for work and a future, and who found it here. In the slow raising of this great stone hospital in the West Virginia hills. Their hands are in every wall. The building they made would outlast them all by well over a century, and is standing still, the longest hand-cut stone building on the whole continent, a monument as much to their patient skill as to the purpose it was built for. It took more than 20 years to complete, the work interrupted by the Great War that tore the country apart in the 1860s, the half-finished building standing exposed as armies moved through the region. But stone is patient, and so were the men who worked it, and slowly, course by course, the great structure rose, until at last its long wings and its tall clock tower stood complete against the hills. When it was finished it looked, as we said, less like a hospital than like a castle, and in a sense it was one. A castle built not for a lord, but for the care of the suffering, raised block by hand-cut block out of the local earth, by the tired, hopeful hands of men far from home. It was slow, painstaking work, and almost as soon as it began, the country tore itself apart in civil war. The building sat half-finished as armies moved through the region. Construction stopped and started. It took more than 20 years, all told, before the great stone structure was truly complete, somewhere around 1881. When it was finished, its main building stretched on and on. The longest hand-cut stone building on the continent, and one of the largest anywhere in the world. Its tall clock tower rose above the trees. From a distance, in the soft light, it looked less like a hospital and more like a castle, or a great manor house set down in the green West Virginia hills. Let's rest here a moment, with the building new and gleaming, the gardens freshly planted, the windows catching the morning. This was the dream of moral treatment made real in stone. For a little while it came close to being what it was meant to be. Let's stay in those early years a while longer, because Kirkbride's vision, when it worked, was a genuinely lovely thing, and it's a calming thing to picture. The whole design was meant to soothe. The long wings were angled so that sunlight would move through every ward across the day, so that no one lay in permanent shadow. The windows were tall and many, and they looked out, always, onto something green and growing. The corridors were wide and high-ceilinged so the air could move freely. Even the route a person walked from their room to the dining hall was planned, so that they would pass windows and light and views of the gardens. Kirkbride believed, deeply, that beauty itself was a kind of medicine, that a troubled mind could be steadied by order and light and the simple daily presence of lovely things. And so, in the good years, that is what this place tried to offer. The grounds around the great stone building were not just decoration. They were part of the cure and part of the life. There were gardens and orchards and a working farm with fields and animals, because the asylum was meant to be largely self-sufficient, growing its own food, supplying its own needs. And the patients, those who were well enough, worked that land as part of their treatment. There was thought to be something healing in honest outdoor labour, in the rhythm of the seasons, in watching something grow because of your own care. So picture them out in the fields on a mild morning, tending crops, feeding animals, walking the gardens, the great stone building with its clock tower rising behind them, the green West Virginia hills folding away on every side. For some, those quiet hours of work in the open air were the steadiest, most peaceful part of their lives. A day there had its gentle shape. Rising with the light, simple meals taken together in the great dining halls, work for those who could, in the gardens or the workshops or the laundry. Quiet hours of rest. Perhaps music, for music was thought to soothe, and many such places had pianos and small gatherings and singing. In the evenings, the long wards settling into stillness, the lamps lit, the sounds of the buildings softening, the night coming down over the hills. It was an enclosed world, and a confining one, yes, but in its best moments, in its best years, it was also a calm and ordered one. A refuge from a world that had often treated its residents with cruelty. So let's rest here, in that early hopeful time. The sunlight moving slowly through the long wards, just as the architect intended. The gardens green outside every window, the clock tower keeping its patient time above the trees. For a little while, before the weight of too many came down upon it, this great stone building did something gentle and good. Let's hold that softly, before we go on. The plan was that it would hold around 250 patients. That was the number Kirkbride's whole philosophy was built around. A small enough community that each person could be known, could be cared for, could be given attention and air and space. 250 souls in a building made of light. And here is where the sad arithmetic of history begins, and I'll tell it to you gently, because there's nothing frightening in it. Only the slow weight of too many people and not enough care. The world did not send 250 people to Weston. It sent far, far more. As the decades passed, the asylum filled, and then overfilled, and then overflowed entirely. By the middle of the 20th century, the building that had been designed for 250 was holding more than 2,000. Some say as many as 2,400 at its most crowded. The rooms meant for one held several. The light and air that Kirkbride had believed could heal were stretched impossibly thin across far too many people. The beautiful idea simply could not survive being asked to hold 10 times what it was built for. You can picture how it happened, slowly, without anyone meaning for it to. There was nowhere else to send people. Families had no other help. The poorhouses and the jails sent their hardest cases. And the building, because it was there, and because it was large, simply kept taking them in. The staff, however good their intentions, could not possibly give 2,000 people the gentle individual attention that 250 had been meant to receive. And so a place built on the idea of dignity slowly, through no single person's fault, became overcrowded and overwhelmed. There's something quietly moving about the records of who was sent to places like this, and why. If you read the old admission books from this era, the reasons listed for committing someone could be heartbreakingly small. People were sent away for things that were not illnesses at all, for grief that lasted too long, for reading too many novels, for religious excitement, for the ordinary confusions of old age, for simply being inconvenient or poor or alone, in a time that had nowhere kinder to put them. Many of the people who lived their whole lives behind those stone walls might never have needed to be there at all, by anything we'd understand today. They were simply people the world didn't know what to do with. And so we can hold them gently in our minds tonight, not as patients in an institution, but as people, ordinary people, who deserved more kindness than their century knew how to give. I'll touch lightly, and only briefly, on the harder treatments, because as with every place we visit, the medicine of the past did some things we'd never do now. In the middle of the 20th century, there was a period when certain drastic procedures were performed on patients in hospitals all across the country. Procedures that doctors of the time genuinely, if wrongly, believed might bring relief. We know now that they did far more harm than good. The asylum at Weston was caught up in that era, as so many were. We don't need the details. We only need to know that those years passed, that medicine eventually understood its mistakes, and that everyone who suffered through them is long beyond all of it now. At peace, far past any harm. We remember them softly, and we let the rest go. By the later 20th century, the world had changed again. New medicines meant that many people who would once have been locked away could now live out in the world, with help. The vast crowded asylums fell out of favour, and rightly so. They began to close, all across the country. The great stone building at Weston grew quieter and emptier, its wings shutting down one by one, until at last, in 1994, after well over a century of standing, it closed its doors entirely. The longest hand-cut stone building on the continent fell silent. Let's pause here and breathe. The empty halls. The long quiet. The clock tower standing still above the trees. And then came the years that come to all these places. The emptiness. The slow patient work of weather and time. Plaster falling softly from the ceilings. Paint peeling in long curls. Dust gathering on the wide windowsills where the sun still came in, just as Kirkbride had designed it to, falling now on empty floors. The building stood alone in its valley, enormous and silent, and the legends gathered around it the way they always do. People spoke of footsteps, of voices, of figures glimpsed in the long corridors. Ghost tours began to run through it at night, and it became famous as one of the most haunted buildings in America. And as always on these calm nights, we can set those stories gently to one side. They are exactly the kind of tales that grow around any vast old building where so many lived and suffered and died, especially one left dark and empty for years. The mind, walking those long corridors in the dark, will conjure almost anything. But there is nothing in those halls now but quiet, and dust drifting in the light, and the long memory of all those gentle, ordinary, forgotten people. Nothing waits there, nothing watches, the building only sleeps. And here, too, there is a kinder ending than abandonment. The great stone building at Weston was not torn down, it was bought and saved, and it stands today as a landmark, cared for, its history told to those who come to learn it. People walk its halls now in the daylight, not to be frightened, but to remember. To remember the beautiful idea it was built on, the idea that even the most troubled mind deserves a place of light and air and dignity. That idea was right. It was only ever asked to carry more than any building could. It's worth holding on to that thought, gently, before we leave this place, because there's real comfort in it. The thing that went wrong at Weston was never the idea. The idea was beautiful, and the idea was right. People who suffer in their minds do deserve light, and air, and dignity, and beauty, and gentleness. We believe that even more firmly now than they did then. What failed was not the dream but the arithmetic of it, the simple cruel fact that there were so many in need and so little in the way of help, so that a place built lovingly for a few hundred was made to hold thousands, and no amount of good design could carry that weight. It's the kind of failure that should make us tender rather than afraid, because it was a failure of a good thing stretched too thin, not of a bad thing done on purpose. And so when people walk those long stone corridors today, by daylight, with a guide, learning the real history of the place, the feeling they are meant to come away with is not horror, but a kind of sober compassion. Compassion for the patients, those thousands of ordinary souls sent there for reasons large and small, many of whom needed only kindness and a place to be. Compassion even for the overwhelmed staff, doing impossible work with too little, in a time that did not yet understand the minds in their care. The building stands now as a kind of memorial to all of that, a vast and beautiful and sorrowful reminder of how far our care for one another has come, and how far it still must go. There is dignity in being remembered that way. The forgotten people of Weston, the ones who lived and died behind those walls and were buried under numbers, are remembered now, spoken of now, their stories told to strangers who walk the halls and feel, perhaps for the first time, that those long ago lives were real and mattered. The great stone building keeps their memory the way a cathedral keeps the memory of the faithful, quietly, patiently, in light through tall windows. So let's leave it holding that memory, in peace. The longest hand-cut stone building on the continent, standing in its green valley, no longer a place of overcrowding and sorrow, but a place of remembrance, cared for, honoured. Its tall clock tower keeping its slow time above the trees, as the evening comes down soft and kind over everything, and the building itself still stands, in the green hills, in the soft evening, holding the memory of everyone who passed through it. So let's leave it there gently, the long stone walls cooling in the dusk, the clock tower dark against the last of the sky, the valley quiet all around. Everyone who ever lived behind those walls is long at rest now, free of all of it, peaceful at last, and the great building sleeps in its valley, doing no harm to anyone, holding only memory and silence and the soft falling of the dark. Rest here as long as you like. There's nowhere we need to be. Chapter 3. Beelitz-Heilstaetten. Now let's cross the ocean all the way to Germany, to a stretch of quiet pine forest south of Berlin, where some of the strangest and most beautiful abandoned buildings in all of Europe stand slowly disappearing beneath the trees. The name is a little difficult, so let me say it softly for you. Beelitz-Heilstaetten. Beelitz-Heilstaetten. The second part of the name simply means a place of healing. Hold that in your mind as we go, because it matters. This too was built to heal. We're back, once again in the age of the White Plague, that same slow sickness of the lungs that built Waverly Hills on its Kentucky hill. By the end of the 1800s, tuberculosis was everywhere in the crowded industrial cities of Europe, and Berlin was no exception. The city had grown enormous and smoky and packed, and the sickness moved easily through its tenements and factories. And so, just as in America, the answer was thought to be the forest. Send the sick away from the foul city air, out into the clean, dry pine woods, and let them rest and breathe and perhaps recover. So beginning in the 1890s, in the pine forest near the little town of Beelitz, a vast complex of sanatorium buildings began to rise. Not one building, but many, dozens of them, spread out among the trees, connected by paths and parkland. There were separate pavilions for men and for women, bathhouses, a great central kitchen, a power station, gardens, and long open balconies and verandas everywhere, because here, as everywhere, the cure was air and rest and sun. The buildings were handsome, even grand, built of warm brick with red-tiled roofs and arched windows, set carefully among the pines so that every patient could look out into green and quiet. By the early 1900s it had grown into one of the largest and most modern places of its kind anywhere in Europe, a whole healing village hidden in the woods. And the daily life of that healing village, in its early years, followed the same gentle pattern as the sanatoriums an ocean away, for the medicine was the same everywhere. Rest, air, sun, good food. quiet. Patients spent long hours on the verandas and balconies, wrapped against the cool of the pine forest, breathing the clean, resinous air that the doctors believed could mend a damaged lung. There were graded walks through the woods for those strong enough, careful, measured exercise along the forest paths. There were water cures in the grand tiled bathhouses. There were generous meals taken in the great dining halls, for building up the body was thought to be half the battle. And there was the forest itself, always, beyond every window, green and quiet and deep, doing its own slow work on the spirit. For the people of smoky, crowded Berlin, to be sent here must have felt like being lifted out of one world and set down gently in another, away from the noise and the soot and the close grey streets, out into the pines, into the silence, into the clean, cold air. Many of them were young, as tuberculosis so often took the young, and many of them, given rest and time and that good forest air, did recover, and went home to the city stronger than they had come. The place worked, as often as the medicine of its day could make it work. It healed people. That was its whole purpose, and for years it fulfilled it, quietly among the trees. Let's rest here for a moment, in those early days, with the new brick buildings warm in the afternoon light, the long verandas full of resting patients wrapped in blankets, the pines standing tall and dark and fragrant all around, the air clean and still. It was a peaceful place, built with real care, a refuge from the noise and smoke of the great city. For years, that's what it was. People came sick and frightened, and many of them grew stronger, and went home. But this place sat in a part of the world where history would move heavily, again and again, across the same ground. And so the story of Beelitz is really the story of all the great changes that swept over Germany in the 20th century, each one washing through these quiet brick pavilions in the woods. The first great change was the First World War. When the war came, the sanatorium in the forest was turned, almost overnight, into a military hospital. Instead of patients with weak lungs, it began receiving soldiers carried back wounded from the front. The peaceful verandas filled with the broken and the recovering. And here I'll mention, simply and without any weight, a small strange fact that history has attached to this place, the kind of footnote that gives these old buildings their air of mystery. Among the many thousands of soldiers treated at Beelitz during that war was a young, wounded, entirely unknown corporal named Adolf Hitler, recovering from an injury before being sent back to the fighting. He was no one yet, just one more wounded young man among countless others in the long wards. He healed, and he left, and the forest closed quietly behind him, and no one there could have known what the century would become. It's only one of those quiet accidents of history that gather around old places. We can note it, and let it drift on by. The war ended. For a time, between the wars, Beelitz went back to being what it had always been, a place of healing in the woods, treating the sick of Berlin. But the great storms of the century were not finished. The Second World War came, and once again the buildings filled with wounded soldiers. And then, in the final months of that war, the Red Army of the Soviet Union swept westward across Germany and took the whole region. When the fighting finally stopped, and the map of Europe was redrawn, this corner of Germany found itself behind what people came to call the Iron Curtain, in the part of the country occupied by the Soviets. And the Soviet army, looking at this enormous, well-built complex of hospital buildings sitting in the quiet forest, decided to keep it. They took it over entirely. And so, for almost 50 years, this German healing place in the pines became a Soviet military hospital, one of the largest the Soviets operated anywhere outside their own country. Think of that, just for a moment. For half a century, in the heart of Germany, behind walls and fences, this was a closed Soviet world. Russian was spoken in the wards. Soviet soldiers and officers were treated there, and their families lived nearby. It was its own sealed-off community, hidden in the forest, cut off from the German country all around it. So few outsiders ever went in that the place became almost a rumour even to the people who lived nearby. It was simply the Russian hospital in the woods, and you did not go there. Let's linger in the forest a while longer, because the setting itself is one of the most peaceful things about this whole strange place. The sanatorium was built among pines, and pines have a particular quiet to them. They do not rattle and chatter the way other trees do. They stand tall and still and dark, and the wind moves through them with a long soft hush, like the sea heard from far away, like slow breathing. Among those trees, the brick pavilions were spread out with space between them, each one set in its own pocket of forest, so that even when the place was full, it never felt crowded out of doors. A patient could walk the quiet paths between the buildings, under the pines, in the green hush, and feel, for a while, simply held by the woods. The buildings themselves were made with real care. Warm red brick, handsome arched windows, broad verandas and balconies on every side, so that the patients could be brought out into the air. There were bathhouses with grand tiled halls, for water treatments were part of the cure. There was a great central kitchen, and a power plant with a tall chimney, and covered walkways so that staff could move between buildings out of the rain. It was, in its day, a marvel of careful design, a whole healing city laid out among the trees, with the same thoughtfulness that went into the grand asylums of America. And through the seasons it changed its character gently. In spring the forest floor greened and softened. In summer the pines were warm and resinous and full of bird song. In autumn the light came low and golden through the trunks. And in winter the snow lay deep and silent among the dark trees, and the whole place became a hush within a hush. Through all the long strange decades that followed, through the wounded soldiers of 2 wars, and then the half-century of the sealed Soviet years, the forest simply kept on being the forest. While the buildings filled and emptied and changed hands and changed languages, the pines stood and breathed and dropped their needles and grew, season after season, patient and indifferent and calm. They had been there before the first brick was laid, and they would be there after the last soldier left. And when at last the people did all go, and the buildings fell silent, the forest did the most natural thing in the world. It simply began, very slowly, to come back in. A seed finding a crack in a step, moss finding a damp wall, a sapling rising through a broken floor toward the light, the woods reclaiming, leaf by patient leaf, the clearing that had been carved from them 100 years before. So let's rest here, among the pines, in the long soft hush of the forest. The brick buildings standing quiet in their pockets of green, the light coming low and golden through the trees. Whatever passed through this place, the forest held it all gently, and the forest holds it still. There is nothing here now but trees, and bird song, and the slow green patience of the woods. Let it hold you too. Let's pause and breathe here, in that strange in-between time. The brick buildings, now decades old, still standing among the pines. The forest a little thicker now, pressing closer. The quiet of a place sealed off from the world, going about its hidden business year after year as the century turned slowly around it. Then, at the very end of the 1980s and the start of the 1990s, the great change came that no one had expected. The Berlin Wall fell. Germany was reunited. The long division of the country and of Europe came suddenly to an end, and the Soviet Union itself, soon after, dissolved. The soldiers who had occupied this corner of Germany for so long began, at last, to go home. There's even a quiet footnote here too, in the confused final days of that era. The former leader of East Germany, a man named Erich Honecker, sick and fallen from power, and with nowhere safe to go, is said to have sheltered for a time in this very complex, hidden among the Soviet doctors who were themselves about to leave. The old order, sick and finished, taking its last refuge in the healing place in the woods, before vanishing from history altogether. By the mid-1990s, the Russians were gone. They packed up and withdrew, and they left the great complex behind them, all those dozens of brick buildings standing empty in the forest. Some parts found new uses, but much of it, a great sprawling portion of it, was simply abandoned. The doors were locked, or left open. The wind moved in, and the forest, which had been waiting patiently at the edges for 100 years, began, very slowly, to come inside. And this truly is what makes Beelitz one of the strangest and most quietly beautiful abandoned places in the world. Because nature has not just grown around these buildings, it has grown into them and through them and over them with a slow green patience that takes the breath away. Picture it. Inside one of the great empty pavilions, a grand staircase winds upward, its old stone steps still elegant, its iron railing still curving gracefully. But the whole thing is covered now, completely, in a soft, thick blanket of green moss, glowing in the dim light from the broken windows, as though the staircase were made of living velvet. Trees have taken root inside the buildings themselves, growing up through the floors, their branches reaching toward the holes in the roofs where the sky shows through. Vines pour down the walls, ferns unfurl in the corners of old wards. The warm brick is going green and gold. Everywhere, gently, without any violence at all, the forest is taking its buildings back, leaf by leaf, root by root, season by season. There is something deeply peaceful in it, when you stop to feel it. Not eerie, not frightening, peaceful. The healing place built among the pines is simply being healed itself, slowly returned to the forest it was carved out of. The patients are long gone. The soldiers are long gone. The wars and the empires that swept through are all finished and faded. And the trees, who were here before any of it, and will be here after, are quietly, gently, reclaiming what was always theirs. Moss does not hurry. The forest keeps no grudges. It only grows, soft and green and slow, over everything we leave behind. Of course, because the buildings stood so silent and strange and beautiful for so long, the legends gathered here as thickly as the moss. People crept in to wander the green ruins, and they came back with stories, as people always do. Whispers of figures in the empty wards, of cold spots, of the long Soviet years leaving something behind in the walls. And as always on these quiet nights, we can let those stories rest. They are only the natural echoes that gather in any vast empty place with so much history layered into it. There is nothing in those green halls now but moss and birdsong and falling light. Nothing waits among the trees that grow up through the floors. The place is simply, gently, going back to the forest. And that is all. And here, as in so many of these stories, there is a kind ending taking shape. In recent years, much of Beelitz has been cared for again, parts have been restored, and in one of the loveliest ideas anyone has had for a place like this. A long elevated walkway was built high among the treetops, winding through the canopy above the green ruins, so that people can stroll gently through the forest and look down at the moss-covered staircases and the trees growing through the rooftops, and feel not fear but wonder. They call it, more or less, the path between the trees and time. Imagine walking it, that high path among the treetops, on a still afternoon. You rise up gently above the forest floor, up among the green crowns of the trees, and you walk out along the winding wooden way, and below you and around you spread the old brick buildings, half drowned now in green. From up here you can see how completely the forest has come back in, roofs open to the sky with saplings rising through them, walls gone soft and emerald with moss and ivy, the famous staircase somewhere below wound about with living green, birds moving through the broken windows as easily as through the branches, and over it all the long soft hush of the pines, that sound like slow breathing, like the sea heard from very far away. There is no fear in it, none at all. What you feel, up there among the leaves, looking down at the gentle ruin, is something closer to peace, and to a strange quiet hope. Because you are watching, with your own eyes, the oldest and kindest process in the world. You are watching the earth take something back, without anger, without violence, simply by growing. Everything human that happened here, all the sickness and all the war and all the long-sealed years of a vanished empire, is being slowly, patiently, lovingly composted back into forest. The trees do not remember the soldiers. The moss does not know it is climbing the work of frightened hands. They only grow, and in growing they heal the whole place, turning a wound in the woods back into woods. That is a deeply restful thing to know as you lie there in the dark. That whatever is built, whatever is suffered, whatever is sealed away and abandoned, the green world is always there at the edges, patient and forgiving, waiting to come quietly back in and make it gentle again. Nothing stays a ruin forever. Everything is, in the end, reclaimed and softened and made green. So let's leave Beelitz to the trees, with our blessing. The treetop path empty now in the falling light, the moss glowing soft on the old stone stairs, the pines breathing their long slow hush over all of it, and the forest growing, leaf by patient leaf, year by quiet year, tucking the whole strange beautiful place gently back beneath its green. People come now to walk softly above the healing place in the woods, and to watch nature doing its slow and patient and beautiful work. So let's leave Beelitz there, high in the green and quiet. The pines standing tall as they have for 100 years. The old brick buildings going gently back to moss and leaf and root. The soft light falling through the broken roofs onto the velvet stairs. Everyone who ever suffered here, the lung patients and the wounded soldiers of 2 wars, and the lonely men of a vanished empire, all of them long gone now, all of them at rest, far beyond every storm that ever passed across this ground. And the forest keeps growing, slow and green and kind, tucking the whole place gently in beneath its leaves. Rest here among the trees. Let the green quiet hold you. There's no hurry at all. Chapter 4. Danvers. Let's cross back over the ocean now, to the northeast coast of America, to a hill in Massachusetts not far from the old town of Salem. If that name stirs something in you, a faint memory of old stories, then you already feel a little of the strange air that hangs around this next place. Because the hill where this asylum was built had a long and shadowed history of its own, long before the first stone was laid. The hill was once called Hawthorne Hill, and the land had belonged, generations earlier, to a man tied to the infamous Salem witch trials of the 1690s. That dark season when fear swept a small community and innocent people were accused and condemned for crimes that existed only in frightened imaginations. That's a heavy piece of history, but it's also a very old one, long settled and long grieved, and I mention it only because it gave the hill a certain reputation before the asylum ever existed. People already thought of it as a place where strange and sorrowful things had happened. So when a great hospital for the troubled mind was raised on that very rise, the stories had somewhere to gather almost from the beginning. But set the old shadows aside for a moment, because the asylum itself, like all the others we've visited tonight, began with that same hopeful idea. It was built on the Kirkbride plan, the same gentle design we walked through in West Virginia, with its long staggered wings reaching out to either side of a tall central building, so that every room could have its share of light and air. It opened in 1878, a grand brick structure crowning the hill, surrounded by farmland and orchards and quiet grounds. Its proper name was the Danvers State Hospital, though over the years it would be known by many names. People called it many things across its long life, as people do with places that loom large in a region's imagination. To some it was simply the state hospital on the hill. To others it carried the older, harder names that earlier ages used for such places, names we have wisely set aside. To the children of the surrounding towns it was the great spooky building you dared each other to look at. And to a lonely writer wandering the back roads, it would become something else again, a shape to hang a story on. But beneath all those names was the same plain reality, a hospital, built with care, meant to shelter and to heal. And in its first years it truly tried to be that. Picture it new, the bricks still bright, the grounds freshly laid out, the long Kirkbride wings reaching to catch the sun. The first patients arrived to find not a dungeon but something closer to a grand country estate, with gardens and orchards and wide views over the New England hills. There were airing courts where they could walk, and workrooms, and a chapel, and music, and the whole gentle apparatus of moral treatment, the belief that order and beauty and kindness could steady a troubled mind. For a while, before the crowds came, it came close to that ideal. the same fragile, hopeful ideal that built every place we have visited tonight. And in its first years, it was meant to be everything the moral treatment movement dreamed of. A beautiful, dignified refuge where the suffering could find peace. Let's rest here, in those early days. The new red brick building on its green hill. The orchards in blossom. The wide windows looking out over the Massachusetts countryside. The same kind hope that built every place we've visited tonight, laid down once more in brick and glass and good intentions. Let's stay in those early years a moment longer, because the setting of Danvers, before the crowds and the decay, was a genuinely lovely one. The hill rose above the surrounding countryside, with long views in every direction, out over fields and woods, and the distant glint of water. The grounds were extensive, with gardens and lawns and a working farm. For here too the asylum was meant to be a largely self-sufficient world, growing much of its own food, the patients working the land as part of their care. In spring the orchards on the hillside came into blossom, and the whole rise was crowned with white and pink against the new green. In summer the fields were worked under the wide New England sky. In autumn the surrounding woods turned to fire and gold, as only New England woods can. It was, by the standards of its purpose, a beautiful place to have been sent. But it's the afterlife of Danvers, its strange second existence in the world's imagination, that makes it linger in the mind, and that's a gentle thing to dwell on rather than a frightening one. Think of how it happened. A solitary writer, walking the New England backroads in the early part of the 20th century, looked up at that brooding silhouette on its hill and felt something stir in him, some shiver of gloom and grandeur, and he carried it home and folded it into his stories. He gave it a new name and set it in an imagined town, and his strange tales were read, over the decades, by more and more people. And then other storytellers, who had loved those tales as young people, borrowed the name again, and built it into a vast modern mythology of their own, until at last that single invented word, born from a real building on a real hill, was known to many millions of people across the entire world, the great majority of whom would never learn that it had begun with an actual asylum in Massachusetts at all. There is something quietly wonderful in that, when you sit with it in the dark, that a real place, full of real and ordinary and mostly forgotten human sorrows, should become immortal not for anything that truly happened there, but as a shape, a silhouette, a feeling, passed from imagination to imagination down the long chain of stories. The real people who lived and suffered on that hill are gone and largely unremembered, but the shape of their home lives on, transformed, in the dreams and stories of strangers who never knew them. It is a strange kind of immortality, but a gentle one, and when the time finally came to tear the old building down, it was precisely that famous shape, that beloved haunting silhouette that people fought to save, so that the great brick face with its peaked tower still stands on the hill today, looking out over the countryside, holding its long quiet vigil exactly as it always has. So let's rest here, on the old hill above Salem, in the soft evening light. The orchards in our imagination still in blossom, the famous silhouette dark and calm against the fading sky. A real place that became a story, and a story that, in the end, helped save the real place. There is nothing frightening here, only an old building, and a long memory, and the gift of being remembered. Let the hill grow quiet, and let yourself grow quiet with it. And then, the same slow sorrow. You can almost guess it by now, because it was the same story everywhere. The hospital was designed for around 500 people, and as the decades passed, it filled and overfilled and overflowed, just as Weston had, just as they all did. By the middle of the 20th century, the building meant for 500 held well over 2,000. The light and air ran thin, the kind idea buckled under the sheer weight of human need, with nowhere else for any of those people to go. The wards grew crowded, the staff grew stretched, and the beautiful Kirkbride building, designed to heal through dignity, became, like so many of its kind, simply too full to give anyone the gentle attention it had been built to provide. I'll touch very lightly here, as I always do, on the harder medicine of the past. Danvers belongs to that same difficult chapter of the 20th century, when certain drastic procedures were performed on the troubled in the mistaken belief that they might help. Some stories even claim that one such procedure was pioneered or perfected here, though the truth of that is uncertain and very likely exaggerated in the retelling. As with everything of that kind, we don't need the details, and we don't need to dwell. The medicine of that era did harm it did not understand, here as in many places, and then it learned better. And everyone who lived through those years is far beyond all of it now, peaceful, at rest. We hold them kindly and we move gently on. Now here is the strange and rather wonderful thing about Danvers, the thing that sets it apart from the others, and it has nothing to do with ghosts at all. It has to do with a story. In the early 20th century, a writer named H.P. Lovecraft, who lived in nearby Providence and who wandered the New England countryside soaking up its old gloom, used the brooding hilltop asylum at Danvers as the model for an imaginary asylum in his strange and shadowy tales. He gave his fictional version a name set in his invented New England town, and that name was Arkham. If that word sounds familiar, it's because it travelled. Decades later, the creators of a certain famous comic book world borrowed that name for the asylum where their most dangerous characters were kept, and so the name Arkham Asylum became known to millions of people all over the world who had never heard of Danvers at all. But the brooding brick building on the hill in Massachusetts was, in a sense, the great-grandfather of all of them. The original, the real place that haunted a writer's imagination and gave the whole world its idea of what a frightening asylum should look like. There's something almost gentle in that, when you think about it, that this real place, with its real and ordinary sorrows, became famous mostly as a shape in stories, a silhouette on a hill. Let's pause here and breathe. The hill, the great dark building against the evening sky, the long wings reaching out into the gathering dusk. A real place that became a legend, while the real people inside it lived their quiet, forgotten lives. By the later 20th century, the great age of the asylums was ending, as we've seen. New medicines, new ideas, a new understanding that people should not be locked away in enormous institutions, but helped to live in the world. The wards at Danvers closed one by one, the population shrinking year after year, until at last, in 1992, the old hospital on the hill closed its doors for good. And then, it stood empty, as they all did, brooding on its hilltop above the trees. For more than a decade it sat abandoned, and in that time it became one of the most photographed and whispered about abandoned buildings in America. People crept up the overgrown hill to wander its decaying halls, and they came back with the usual stories of shadows and sounds and figures in the dark. The old reputation of the hill feeding the new tales of the empty building. And as always on these calm nights, we set those stories down. They are the natural growth of any large, dark, empty place, especially one already wrapped in old legends before it was even built. There was nothing in those halls but dust and silence and the long memory of all those crowded, forgotten lives. Danvers does not have quite the gentle ending that some of the others do, and I'll tell you honestly what happened, because there's a quiet melancholy in it that suits a place like this. In the mid-2000s, the old hospital was largely torn down to make way for apartments. Most of the great Kirkbride building came down, but there was an outcry, a real and heartfelt one, from people who loved the old building and its history, and so the developers agreed to preserve the most iconic part, the tall central section, the great brick face of it with its high-peaked tower, the silhouette that had haunted Lovecraft and inspired 100 stories. That central facade still stands today, restored, looking down from the hill much as it always did, even though new buildings have risen around and behind it. So if you were to drive past that hill in Massachusetts in the soft light of evening, you would still see it, the great brooding brick face on the rise, the famous silhouette, watching over the countryside the way it has for nearly 150 years. Changed, yes, surrounded by the new world. But still there, still keeping its long quiet vigil over the hill. And it keeps that vigil through all the seasons still, that famous brick face on the rise. though the world around it has changed beyond recognition. In spring, the trees that climb the old hill come into leaf around it, softening its hard old lines with green. In summer, families live in the new buildings risen behind and beside it, children playing on lawns where orchards and fields once stood, most of them never knowing the strange long history of the silhouette that watches over their homes. In autumn, the New England woods around the hill catch fire with colour, just as they did when a lonely writer first looked up and felt a story stir in him. And in winter, the snow settles on the old peaked tower, exactly as it has for a century and a half, white and silent, the great brick face looking out over the muffled countryside, patient as ever. There is something gentle in that survival, in the way the old building has been allowed to keep watching even as ordinary life has grown up all around it. It was not erased. It was not entirely lost. The shape that haunted 100 stories still stands on its hill, but it stands now over a living place, over families and gardens and the small busy happiness of ordinary days. The sorrow that once filled it has long since drained away into the past. What remains is only the silhouette, dark and dignified against the sky, a piece of memory kept standing out of love rather than fear. And the people, the real people, the thousands of ordinary forgotten souls who lived out their crowded, difficult lives behind that brick face long ago, are all at rest now. Every one, far beyond the reach of that hard old time. We can think of them kindly as we look up at the tower. We can let the stories and the legends fall away, and remember instead that they were people, like us, who deserved more gentleness than their age could give, and who are, all of them, at peace at last. So let the great brick face keep its vigil over the living and the remembered alike. As the evening settles soft and blue over the old hill above Salem, and the first lights come on in the windows below, warm and ordinary and kind. So let's leave Danvers there, on its old hill above Salem. The famous silhouette dark against the last light of the day. The orchards long gone, the crowds long gone, the writer who made it a legend long gone too, all of them folded back into the past. Everyone who ever lived behind those brick walls is at rest now, every sorrow of that crowded place finally quiet, every troubled mind finally at peace. And the great brick face on the hill simply watches the evening come down, harming no one, holding only memory, as the stars come out one by one above the old town below. Rest now. Let the hill grow dark and quiet in your mind. We have only a little further to wander, and there is all the time in the world. Chapter 5. Willard, now I want to take you somewhere a little quieter and a little more tender than the rest. There's no great brooding tower here, no famous silhouette, no whispered horror. Before we go on, let's sit with the lake a moment, because the setting of Willard is half of its gentleness. The Finger Lakes were carved long ago by ice, gouged deep and narrow into the land, and Seneca is the largest and deepest of them, a long blade of dark water lying north to south, so deep in places that it almost never freezes, even in the hardest winters. To live on its shore was to live always in the presence of that great calm body of water, changing with the seasons, silver under morning mist, blue under summer sky, slate grey under autumn cloud, the far shore a low green line in the distance. There were worse places in the world to spend a quiet life, and many of the people at Willard did exactly that. They spent quiet lives there. The work of the place, the farm and the gardens, and the daily chores gave shape to the days. The seasons turned, the lake kept its long calm watch, and the years went by, gently, one after another, for people the world outside had mostly stopped thinking about. That's what makes the suitcases so quietly devastating, and so quietly beautiful, when you really let yourself imagine them. Picture, one more time, what was actually found in that attic. Not horrors. Belongings. The ordinary, treasured, carefully chosen things that people pack when they are going somewhere and mean to come back. Let yourself imagine just a few of them, gently, the way the people who found them did. A suitcase belonging to a man who had been a craftsman, packed with his good tools, kept oiled and ready, the tools of a trade he surely meant to take up again. a trunk belonging to a woman who had once moved in a wider world, packed with fine dresses and good shoes and a few pieces of jewellery, the wardrobe of a life she had every reason to think she would return to. A case packed with photographs, dozens of them, faces of family and friends. A whole web of love folded carefully between layers of clothing, letters tied with ribbon, a favourite book, a sewing kit, a child's keepsake, kept by someone who had once been a parent. Each one a small, complete, heartbreaking portrait of a person who walked through the door of that place expecting, surely, that the door would one day open again the other way. And it did not. They stayed, and their suitcases went up into the quiet of the attic, and there they waited, in the dry still air, through decades of seasons, through wars and changes, and the slow turning of the whole century, perfectly preserved, perfectly patient, holding the shape of their owners' hopes, long after their owners themselves had gone into the ground in graves, marked only with numbers. Until at last, when the place closed forever, someone climbed those attic stairs, and opened a door, and found, waiting in the dust, hundreds of carefully packed lives. And here is where the sadness turns, very gently toward grace. And it's worth dwelling on, because it's the kind of thing that's good to fall asleep believing. The suitcases were not thrown away. People understood, the moment they saw them, that they were holding something sacred. And so the careful, loving work began. A photographer gave years of his life to documenting each case and its contents with great tenderness and respect, laying out the tools, the dresses, the photographs, the letters, and photographing them so beautifully that to look at the images is to feel, suddenly, that you have met the person. Researchers searched the old records to recover the names, the histories, the human facts of these forgotten people. Exhibitions were made, their faces were seen again, their names were spoken again. People who had vanished entirely from the world's memory were, a century later, gently lifted back into the light by strangers who simply believed that every one of those lives had mattered. So let's rest here, on the shore of the deep old lake, in the soft grey light. The water still and patient, the quiet lives that played out along its edge, and the suitcases that held them, and the kind hands that opened those suitcases at last and gave the names back. There is no ghost in this story. There is only the long ache of being forgotten, and then the quiet mercy of being remembered. Everyone who lived on this shore is at peace now, beneath the gentle hills, beside the deep calm water. And they are not forgotten anymore. Let that be the thought that carries you, to be remembered, in the end, by someone who never even knew you, simply because you were a person, and you mattered. There is a great softness in that. Let it hold you. This place keeps its strangeness folded up small, in a way that's almost unbearably gentle once you understand it. So let your breathing slow, and come with me to the shore of a long deep lake in the countryside of upstate New York, to a place called Willard. It sits on the edge of Seneca Lake, one of the long narrow finger lakes that lie across that part of New York, like the marks of fingers pressed into the earth. The water is deep and dark and very old, and the land around it is gentle farmland and woods and quiet hills. The asylum at Willard opened in 1869 on that calm shore, and from the beginning it was meant for a particular kind of patient, not the temporary cases, the people who might recover and go home. Willard was built for the chronic patients, the ones the other hospitals had given up on, the ones thought to be beyond any hope of cure, the ones who, once they arrived, were expected to stay. And stay they did. Many of the people who came to Willard came for the rest of their lives. That phrase deserves to be sat with gently, because it holds so much. For the rest of their lives, not a stay of weeks or months, but a whole remaining lifetime, spent on the shore of that one lake, within the bounds of that one institution. A person might arrive in the prime of life and grow old there, watching decades of seasons turn over the same water, the same hills, the same familiar buildings. They might see other patients come and go, or come and stay as they had. They might form quiet friendships that lasted 30 or 40 years. They might have their small routines, their preferred chair, their place at the table, their particular view of the lake that they watched through all the long years. A whole human life, with all its ordinary need for company and habit and small daily comforts, lived out inside those walls. It was a confined existence, and a lonely one in many ways, cut off from the wider world that had largely forgotten them. We should not soften that too much. But it was also, for many, a settled and orderly life, with food and shelter and care and the great calm presence of the lake, in a century that had few other places to offer them. They were people living lives, not merely patients filling beds. And that is exactly what their suitcases, found so long after, would prove beyond any doubt. Here were people. Here were lives. Here was someone, in each and every case, who had once packed a bag full of hope. They arrived as young men and women, and they grew old there, on the shore of the lake, and they died there, and were buried there, often in graves, marked only with numbers. Let's rest here a moment, gently, on that quiet shore, the long lake stretching away, silver under a soft sky, the handsome old buildings set back among the trees. It was, in its way, a peaceful place to live out a life. There were gardens and farmland that the patients worked, and the great calm presence of the lake always there beyond the windows. Many who lived there were treated kindly enough, within the limits of what their age understood. But the deep sadness of Willard is simply this, that so many people spent their entire lives there, decades upon decades, often forgotten by the world outside. Their names slipping away, their stories untold. They came, and the door closed softly behind them, and the years went by, and the lake kept its long patient watch, and most of them were never spoken of again. The asylum stayed open for a very long time, more than a century, far longer than most. It treated its quiet population of long-stay patients through generation after generation, as the world changed utterly beyond its gates. And then, at last, in 1995, like all the others, it closed. And now I'll tell you the thing that makes Willard one of the strangest and most haunting places in this whole long story, though not in any frightening way. It's strange in the way that quietly breaks your heart, and then, somehow, gently mends it again. When the hospital was closing, and workers were going through the old buildings one last time before they were shut up forever, someone climbed up into one of the attics. And there, in the dust and the dim light, they found something that no one had expected. Suitcases, hundreds of them. Trunks and bags and cases, stacked and stored and forgotten. Hundreds of pieces of luggage, each one belonging to a patient who had arrived at Willard sometime over the long decades, carrying their possessions with them, expecting, surely, that they might one day need them again, that they might one day leave. And then they never did. They stayed for the rest of their lives, and their suitcases were taken up to the attic and stored, and there they sat, untouched, for years and years and years, long after their owners had died. Picture them, found at last in that quiet attic. Hundreds of suitcases, beautifully preserved by the still dry air, each one still packed with the things a person had chosen to bring with them into a new and frightening place. And when, carefully and respectfully, those suitcases were opened, what spilled out was nothing less than the lost lives of forgotten people, captured and held and waiting all that time. Folded clothes, kept neat for decades. Photographs of family. Letters, books, a set of carpenter's tools, packed by a man who must have meant to keep working. Fine dresses, packed by a woman who must have hoped to wear them again. Toiletries, sewing kits, keepsakes, small treasured things. Each suitcase was a portrait of a whole person, their work, their family, their hopes, the life they had been living right up until the moment the door closed behind them. People who had been reduced, in the records, to a number on a grave. And here, suddenly, were their dresses, their photographs, their tools, their handwriting. Here was the proof that they had been real, whole, particular people, with histories and loves and futures they had fully expected to return to. Let's pause here and breathe, and let that settle softly. There's grief in it, yes, but there's something else too. something almost like rescue. Because what happened next was beautiful. Those suitcases and the stories they held were not thrown away. They were saved. Historians and photographers and ordinary caring people took up the work of preserving them, of photographing each suitcase and its contents with great care and respect, of researching the lives of the people they had belonged to, of giving back, one by one, the names and the stories that the years had taken away. A photographer spent years lovingly documenting them. Exhibitions were made of them. Books were written. And so people who had vanished into an institution 100 years ago, people who died forgotten and were buried under numbers, suddenly had their faces seen again, their names spoken again, their lives honoured again, by strangers who had never met them, but who looked at their carefully folded clothes and their treasured photographs and thought, this was a person. This person mattered. This person should be remembered. There is no ghost story here that could possibly be as moving as the truth. The strangeness of Willard isn't anything supernatural. It's the simple, staggering fact of all those packed suitcases waiting in the dark for decades, each one holding a whole human life that the world had set down and forgotten. And the comfort of Willard is that those lives were found again, that they were lifted gently out of the dust and the dark and held up to the light and remembered, at last, with the tenderness they should have had all along. So when we think of Willard, let's not think of fear. Let's think of those quiet people on the shore of the long lake, living out their lives in the gentle countryside. And let's think of their suitcases, packed with such hope. And let's think of the kind strangers who, a century later, opened them so carefully and said their names again. There is something deeply peaceful in being remembered. Let's stay with that thought a while, because it's the gentlest thing in this whole long night, and a good thing to fall asleep holding. So much of what frightens us about places like Willard, about old asylums and abandoned hospitals and forgotten institutions, is really a fear of being forgotten ourselves. That is the true ache beneath the ghost stories, if you look closely. The dread is not really of the dead, it is of vanishing, of being set down by the world and never picked up again, of becoming a number on a stone, a suitcase in an attic, a name no one remembers and no one says. It is one of the oldest human fears there is, and Willard, of all places, turns out to be the gentle answer to that fear, because the people of Willard were forgotten as completely as anyone has ever been forgotten, lost inside an institution for whole lifetimes, buried under numbers, their names slipping out of the world entirely. And then they were found again. Not by family, not by anyone who had ever known them, by strangers, a century later, who opened their suitcases and saw their dresses and their tools and their photographs and thought, simply, this was a person, and this person mattered, and this person should be remembered. And so they were. Their names were recovered, their faces were seen, their stories were told. They were lifted, gently, back into the light. There is a deep comfort in that, if you let it in. It means that no one is ever truly beyond being remembered. It means that mattering does not depend on being famous, or being mourned by the right people, or leaving some great mark on the world. A folded dress can speak for you across 100 years. A box of photographs can say, to a stranger who never knew you, here was a whole life. Here was someone who loved and was loved. The kindness of remembering reaches backward through time and finds even the most forgotten and says their names again. So rest in that, on the shore of the deep old lake. You are not forgotten. No one truly is, in the end. The lake keeps its long patient watch over all the quiet lives along its shore, and the suitcases gave their owners back to the light, and somewhere, always, there is someone willing to open the case and see the dresses and say the name. Let that gentle certainty hold you. Everyone is remembered, in the end. Everyone matters. And everyone, at last, comes to rest, in being seen. Everyone who lived on that quiet shore is at rest now, beneath the soft hills, beside the deep old lake. But they are not forgotten anymore. Their dresses and their photographs and their handwriting told us who they were, and we listened. And that somehow makes the whole long sad story end in something very close to grace. Let's leave Willard there on the shore of Seneca Lake in the last soft light of the day. The deep water still and silver, the old buildings quiet among the trees, all those gentle forgotten lives finally remembered, finally honoured, finally at peace. And the lake keeps its long patient watch, as it has for 150 years, calm and deep and kind, holding the memory of everyone who ever lived along its shore. Rest here a while. There's a great softness in this place. Let it carry you. Chapter 6. Gonjiam. Now let's travel halfway around the world, to South Korea, to a place whose name became famous far beyond its own country, mostly because of a question that no one could quite seem to answer. The place is called Gonjiam. Let me say it gently for you, Gonjiam. It was a psychiatric hospital set in the hills outside Seoul, and for many years it has been spoken of in lists and articles all over the world as one of the most unsettling abandoned places anywhere on Earth. And the strange thing, the thing that makes it belong in our collection tonight, is how much of its dark reputation grew not from anything that was known about it, but from how little was known about it. The hospital opened sometime in the 1960s, a modest building in the countryside meant to care for psychiatric patients. For a few decades it did just that, quietly, the way countless small hospitals do, without any fame or fear attached to it at all. And those quiet decades are worth dwelling on for a moment, because they are the real story of the place, far more than the legend that came later. For most of its life, the hospital in the Korean hills was simply that, a working hospital, unremarkable, going about the ordinary daily business of caring for people who were unwell. Doctors came to work in the mornings, nurses tended the wards, patients arrived and were treated, and many of them improved and went home. And the rest were looked after, as well as the medicine of the time allowed. The seasons turned over the hills around it, the green wet summers and the cold clear winters of that part of the world. Meals were cooked, beds were made, records were kept in careful handwriting. It was a place of work and routine and small ordinary kindnesses, exactly like 10,000 other modest hospitals scattered across the world, none of which anyone tells frightening stories about at all. That is the version of Gonjiam almost no one remembers, because there is nothing in it to thrill or scare. But it is the true version, the one that occupied nearly the whole of the building's life. The decades of quiet, useful, unremarkable care. The fear came only at the very end, only after the doors closed and the silence fell and the human imagination got to work on the emptiness. While the place was alive, it was simply a hospital, doing what hospitals do. We should remember it that way, fairly, before the legend takes it. It was simply a place where unwell people were cared for, in the hills, away from the city. And then, sometime in the 1990s, around 1996, it closed. The doors shut, the patients went elsewhere, and the building was left empty in the hills. So far there is nothing strange in this at all. It's the same story as so many of the others, a hospital that opened, served its time, and closed when its time was done. But what happened next is where the legend began to grow, and it grew, oddly enough, out of silence and confusion, rather than out of any real horror. You see, after the hospital closed, it was not torn down. It just sat there, empty, year after year. And the longer it sat, the more the local stories began to bloom around it. People whispered that the closure had been sudden and mysterious, that something terrible had happened there, that patients had died in great numbers, that the owner had fled the country in the night, that the building was cursed, and that this was the real reason no one would tear it down. These rumours spread, and grew, and fed on one another, until the empty hospital in the hills had become, in the popular imagination, one of the most haunted and sinister places in all of South Korea. It began appearing on international lists of the world's scariest locations. It's worth pausing here, gently, to think about why a place like this becomes frightening at all. because understanding it is a deeply calming thing. The kind of understanding that lets the fear drain quietly out of the dark. An empty building is, in plain fact, just an empty building. Brick and glass and silence. It does nothing. It wants nothing. It holds no one. And yet we look at it, especially in the dark, especially when we do not know its story, and we feel a chill, and we begin, almost helplessly, to imagine. That chill is not coming from the building. It is coming from us. It is the oldest reflex of the human mind, the one that kept our distant ancestors alive. The instinct that fills every shadow and every silence with the possibility of danger, just in case. A rustle in the grass might be the wind, or it might be a predator, and the minds that assumed the worst were the minds that survived to become ours. So we are built, all of us, to people the darkness with threats that are not there. It is not a flaw, it is a very old kind of caution. But it means that an empty hospital, standing silent and unexplained in the hills, becomes a kind of blank screen onto which we project every fear we carry. And rumour does the rest. A story passes from one person to another, and at each telling it grows a little, sharpens a little, darkens a little, because a darker story is a more memorable one, and the tellers, without meaning to, shape it toward dread. Soon the ordinary closed hospital, shut for reasons as dull as bad plumbing and a tangle of paperwork, has become, in the shared imagination of a whole country, a place of mass death and curses, and fleeing owners and things that should not be disturbed. None of it true, all of it grown, like moss, out of the simple fact that no one was telling the real, boring human story, and so the imagination rushed in to fill the silence. That, more than anything supernatural, is the true subject of Gonjiam. It is a monument to the way fear blooms in the absence of information, the way the unknown is almost always more frightening than the known, the way our own minds are the most reliable ghost makers of all. And then, as we said, came the film, which took the legend and made it larger still, and carried the name around the world, even as the real building was quietly being demolished, its mysteries dissolving into ordinary rubble and ordinary ground. The fear outlived the place entirely. The legend floated free of the brick it had grown on, and went on frightening people in cinemas and stories, while the actual hillside where the hospital had stood went quiet, and ordinary, and harmless, under the same Korean sky it had always known. So let's rest here, in that gentle understanding. The empty building was only ever an empty building. The fear was only ever our own, the old reflex of a cautious species, doing what it has always done in the dark. There was nothing there. There is nothing there now. And the same is true, you know, of so many of the dark imaginings that visit any of us in the quiet of the night, when the mind is left alone with a silence and begins, helplessly, to fill it. They are not real. They are only the old machinery of caution, running on in the dark. You can let them go. You can let the silence be just silence, and the dark be just dark, soft and empty and safe. There is nothing waiting in it. There never was. Let that truth settle over you like a blanket, and rest. Its name travelled around the globe. People came from far away just to stand outside it and feel afraid. But let's do here what we always do, gently and honestly. Let's set the legend beside what's actually known, and let the truth take some of the weight off the story. The real reasons the hospital closed appear to have been, by every sober account, entirely ordinary. Not a curse. Not a tragedy. The kinds of mundane problems that close businesses everywhere. Difficulties with the building's sewage and sanitation systems, and financial troubles. The owner, far from vanishing in some sinister way, is generally understood to have simply moved abroad, as people do. And the reason the building sat empty and undemolished for so long, the very thing that made it seem cursed, was apparently the most ordinary thing of all, a tangle of confusion over who actually owned the land and the property, a dispute that dragged on for years and left no one with the clear authority or the will to tear it down. So it simply stood there, empty, caught in paperwork, while the stories grew up around it like weeds. Isn't that often the way? A building stands silent and unexplained, and because no one tells its real dull story, the human imagination rushes in to fill the silence with something far more dramatic. The emptiness itself becomes frightening, the not knowing becomes the horror. And a perfectly ordinary closed hospital, shut for reasons as unremarkable as bad plumbing and unclear ownership, becomes a legend whispered about on the far side of the world. That, truly, is the strangeness of Gonjiam. It is a mystery made almost entirely out of the absence of an answer. Let's pause here and breathe. The empty building in the green Korean hills. The quiet. The years going by. Nothing happening there at all, really, except the slow work of weather and the steady growth of stories. The legend reached its peak when, a few years ago, in 2018, a popular horror film was made that used the hospital's fearsome reputation as its subject, sending fictional characters into a fictional version of the place. The film was a great success, and it carried the name of Gonjiam to an even wider audience around the world, cementing its fame as a place of dread. But here is the quiet, almost gentle irony of it. By around the same time, the real building, the actual hospital that all the fear had gathered around, was finally, after all those years of confusion, torn down. The ownership questions were at last resolved, and the empty structure that had frightened a nation was simply, undramatically, demolished. The legend reached the height of its fame at almost the very moment the real place ceased to exist. And so the hillside where it stood is just a hillside again now, which is, when you think about it, the most reassuring ending of all. Where the brooding building once gathered all those whispers, there is now only open ground, or new growth, or the ordinary business of a quiet corner of the Korean countryside. The plumbing that failed, the paperwork that tangled, the owner who simply moved away, the demolition crews who finally, undramatically, took the empty shell down. All of it as mundane as the closing of any old business anywhere. The fearsome place dissolved back into the green hills it had grown out of, and the hills did not notice, and the sky did not change, and the world went quietly on. It's worth letting that sink in as you lie there, because it's the truth behind every frightening empty place we've visited tonight, and behind a great many of the frightening empty places of the mind as well. The dread was always larger than the thing. The shadow was always longer than whatever cast it. Strip away the rumours and the films and the long whispered exaggerations, and what remains, every single time, is something ordinary and human and sad and entirely harmless. A hospital that closed, a building that emptied, people who moved on, ground that returned to grass. There was never anything in the dark of Gonjiam but the dark itself, and the dark, as we have said, is only ever the dark, soft and empty and safe. The legend will go on, of course, in films and in lists, and in the stories people like to frighten themselves with. But it has come loose from the world now, like a balloon let go, drifting free of any real place it could ever harm anyone from. It is only a story now, and stories cannot hurt you, lying here, warm and safe in the dark. So let's leave the green Korean hills in peace, the ground quiet where the building used to be, the fear floating off harmlessly into the realm of tales, the real and ordinary truth settling gently back over everything. There was nothing there, there is nothing there, and there is nothing in your dark either, tonight, but rest. And so today, if you went looking for the famous haunted hospital of Gonjiam, you would not find it. There is no brooding building in the hills anymore. There is only the memory of one, and the stories, and the film, and the long lesson the place quietly teaches, that so much of what frightens us in the dark is simply our own minds, filling an empty silence with shapes that were never really there. There is something rather peaceful in that, when you let it settle. The fearsome place was never as fearsome as the rumours said. The mystery was mostly made of missing information. And now even the building is gone, returned to ordinary ground in the quiet Korean hills, while its legend floats on, harmless, in films and stories, hurting no one. Whoever was ever truly cared for in that small hospital is long gone, long at peace, and the frightening empty shell that gathered all those whispers has dissolved back into the earth it stood on. So let's leave Gonjiam there, in the green hills outside the great city, the ground quiet now where the building used to stand, the stories drifting on without it, like mist, like smoke, like all the frightening things that turn out, in the calm light of morning, to have been nothing at all. There is nothing there to fear, and there never really was. Only an empty building, and a long silence, and the human habit of imagining the worst into the dark. Rest now. Let that gentle truth ease you. The dark is only dark. There is nothing waiting in it. We have just one more place to visit, and then we'll let the night close softly over all of them. Chapter 7. Aradale, for our last place tonight, let's travel as far as we can go, all the way to the other side of the world, to the state of Victoria, in southern Australia, to a hill above a country town called Ararat. There, spread across the rise with views out over the golden countryside, stands one of the largest abandoned asylums in the entire world, so large that it was less a building than a town unto itself. Its name is Aradale, Aradale, and to walk its grounds is to understand just how completely these places were once meant to contain a whole human life, from beginning to end, within their own walls. It opened in 1867, back when this part of Australia was still raw and new to European settlement, in the years after gold had been found in the region and the country towns had swelled with hopeful diggers. Among all those new arrivals were people who became unwell in their minds, and the young colony, like the old countries it had come from, decided to build a great institution to house them. They chose the hill above Ararat, and there they raised, over the following decades, an enormous complex, not one building but dozens of them, more than 60 by some counts. There were wards and dormitories and dining halls, a bakery, a farm, gardens, workshops, its own water supply, its own everything. The idea, in keeping with the times, was that the asylum should be entirely self-sufficient, a closed and self-contained world where the patients could live and work and be cared for without ever needing to leave. They grew their own food. Let's stay in that self-contained world a while, because the daily life of such a place, in its quieter aspects, is a soothing thing to picture, and Aradale ran for so long that its rhythms became almost like the rhythms of an old village anywhere. There was a farm, and the farm needed working, every day, in every season. There were animals to be fed and milked, fields to be ploughed and sown and harvested, an orchard to be tended. There were bakeries that filled the morning air with the smell of bread, and kitchens that cooked for hundreds, and laundries with their great steaming coppers, and workshops where things were built and mended. And the patients, those well enough, did much of this work, for labour was thought to be steadying, and a person with a task and a place in the daily round was thought to do better than a person left idle. So the days had a shape, an old and human shape, governed by the sun and the seasons and the simple needs of a community that had to feed and clothe and keep itself. Picture a morning there, in the good years, the sun coming up over the wide Victorian plains, vast and golden and slow, the smell of bread from the bakery, the animals stirring in the farm, people moving out to the gardens and the fields in the cool of the early day, before the great heat came. And the heat did come, for this is a hot, dry country in its summers, the sky enormous and pale, the grass gone to gold, the gum trees hanging silver green and still in the shimmering air, the whole landscape humming with cicadas. Then the long mild autumns, and the green damp winters when the hills turned briefly emerald and the nights came cold and clear. And always, over all of it, that enormous southern sky, bigger than any sky in the northern world, going on and on to a horizon impossibly far away. Across more than 120 years, generation after generation lived inside that rhythm. People arrived as the young men and women of one age, and grew old as the world changed utterly beyond the gates, watching, if they ever looked outward, a whole century pass by. The horse gave way to the motor car in the lane below the hill. 2 world wars came and went on the far side of the earth. Fashions and governments and ways of thinking rose and fell. And on the hill, the bread was still baked, the gardens still tended, the seasons still turned, the great sky still arched overhead. It was a confined life, and a forgotten one, and we should not pretend it was anything but hard in many ways. But it was also, in its long, slow rhythm, a strangely steady one, governed by the oldest and gentlest of clocks, the sun and the soil and the turning year. So let's rest here, on the great golden hill, beneath that enormous sky. The smell of bread on the morning air, the gardens green against the gold, the gum trees still in the heat, a whole quiet world, turning slowly through its seasons, holding its people through the long generations. Whatever hardships passed there, the hill held them all, and the sky watched over them all, and the seasons carried them all gently along. And now they rest, every one of them, beneath that same wide sky, in the deep quiet of the country at the far edge of the world. Let the golden hush of it settle over you. They tended their own animals. They made much of what they used. It was, in the most literal sense, a village of the forgotten, set apart on its hill, turned quietly in on itself, year after year, for well over 100 years. Let's rest here a moment, looking out from that hill over the wide Australian countryside. The golden grass, the gum trees, the enormous pale sky, the great spread of old buildings, their verandas and their gardens. It is, in its setting, a beautiful place, full of light and air and distance. And like all the others, it began with that same intention, to give the troubled a place of safety and order, away from a world that did not know how to hold them. Because it operated for so very long, well over a century, an enormous number of people passed through Aradale across the generations. Tens of thousands lived there over its lifetime, and a great many of them died there too, and were buried in the grounds. For this was a place where people commonly came to stay for the rest of their lives, just as at Willard on its faraway lake. The exact numbers who died there over all those decades are uncertain, and the figures you sometimes hear are likely rounded up and softened by time. But there is no doubt that across more than 100 years, a vast quiet multitude of human lives began, continued, and ended on that hill. Whole lifetimes lived out within those grounds. It's a sobering thought, but a gentle one too, in its way. All those people, sheltered for better or worse on the same hill, beneath the same wide sky, for so very long. There was one part of the complex that was different from the rest, and I'll mention it lightly, because it adds to the place's strange reputation, without our needing to dwell on anything dark. Nearby stood a separate, older, sterner building of bluestone, which had begun life as a colonial gaol, and was later used to house the small number of patients considered the most dangerous. Those who had been found to have committed serious acts, but were judged too unwell to be treated as ordinary prisoners. This grim little fortress, quite different from the open-airy wards of the main asylum, housed a handful of difficult cases for many years. It's the part of Aradale that the ghost tours love best, naturally, but even there, the truth is mostly just sadness. A few deeply unwell people, locked away in stone, living out their strange and isolated lives. They too are long gone now, long past all of it, at rest like everyone else on that hill. Aradale kept going far longer than most institutions of its kind. While the great asylums of America and Europe were closing through the 1960s, 70s and 80s, this one on its Australian hill carried on, a living relic of an older age, right up until the 1990s, when at last it too was closed. After more than 120 years, the great self-contained village of the forgotten finally fell silent. And what a silence it must have been, after so long. For more than a century, that hill had hummed with the low constant sound of a working community, the animals and the kitchens and the workshops, the footsteps in the corridors, the voices in the wards. The endless small business of feeding and clothing and tending hundreds of people, day after day, year after year, generation after generation. And then, at the end, all of that simply stopped. The last patients left. The last staff turned the last keys. The farm went quiet. The the kitchens went cold, and the great spread of buildings stood empty on the hill under the enormous sky, with nothing moving but the wind in the grass and the slow wheeling of the stars at night. There is a particular kind of peace in a place that has finally been allowed to rest after working for so very long. The hill had given more than 120 years of unbroken service, holding the troubled and the forgotten through war and depression and all the long changes of a century, never once stopping, never once falling quiet. And now, at last, it could. The buildings could simply stand, in the gold light and the green winters, and be still, and be done. Like an old worker finally set free of the daily round, finally able to sit in the sun and rest. And it was not abandoned to ruin, as we said, but kept and cared for, its grand old buildings preserved as the genuine heritage they are, parts of the great complex given gentle new life. So people come up the hill now in the kind light of day, to learn, to remember, to stand on the verandas and look out over that same vast golden view that countless quiet souls gazed upon across more than 100 years. And in standing there, in looking out at what they looked out at, the visitors keep faith with them, in a small way. They remember that real people lived whole lives on this hill, beneath this sky, and that those lives mattered. So let the great hill rest now, its long work finally done. The buildings standing quiet and honoured under the enormous southern sky, the golden grass moving softly in the evening wind, a whole world that turned for more than a century, finally and gently at peace. Beneath more stars than you have ever seen. The farm stopped, the kitchens went cold, the wards emptied, and the enormous complex stood quiet on its hill, looking out over the golden country as it always had, but with no one left inside. Let's pause here, in that great silence. The wide sky, the empty verandas, the gardens going slowly wild, a whole world shut down at last. And then, of course, came the legends. A place this large, this old, this full of long-lived sorrow, could hardly avoid them. People speak of figures in the windows, of footsteps in the empty wards, of the old bluestone gaol holding on to something of its difficult past. Ghost tours walk the grounds by night, and the stories multiply with every telling, and as always, on these quiet nights of ours, we can set them down with kindness. They are the natural growth of any vast old place where so many lives were lived and ended. There is nothing in those wards now but dust and light, and the great Australian silence. Nothing waits on that hill. The place only sleeps, beneath its enormous sky, and here, as in so many of these stories, the ending is gentler than the abandonment. Aradale was not torn down. Its grand old buildings, being heritage of real importance, have been preserved, and parts of the great complex have found new life, used now for study, for tours by daylight, for the quiet work of remembering. People come up the hill not to be frightened but to learn, to walk the verandas, to look out over the same golden view that countless patients once gazed at across more than a century, and to remember all those quiet lives that played out on that rise above the town. So let's leave Aradale there, on its hill at the far edge of the world. The golden grass moving softly in the evening wind, the gum trees dark against the enormous fading sky, the great old buildings standing quiet and preserved, holding their long memory. Everyone who ever lived and worked and grew old and died on that hill is at peace now, every one of them, the whole vast quiet multitude resting beneath the same wide sky that watched over them in life. And the hill grows dark and still, and the stars come out across the southern sky, more stars than you have ever seen, and the whole place sleeps. Rest now. We have come a long way together tonight, all the way around the world. Let the southern stars settle over you, and let's draw the night gently to its close. So here we are, at the end of our long, quiet journey, having wandered all the way around the world and back, from a hill in Kentucky to a forest in Germany, from a lake in New York to a great golden hill in Australia. We've stood in the doorways of so many empty places tonight, and I hope by now that none of them frighten you. I hope they've come to feel almost familiar, the way a story you've heard before feels familiar, soft and known and safe. Let's gather them up in our minds, gently, one last time, before we let them go. Notice the thing they all share, the quiet thread that runs through every one of them. Every single one of these places began with hope. Not one of them was built to be a place of horror. They were built, all of them, out of one of the kindest ideas the world has ever had, the idea that people who are suffering, in their bodies or in their minds, deserve a place of light and air and rest and dignity. The grand Kirkbride buildings with their wings spread wide to catch the sun. The forest sanatoriums built to let weak lungs breathe clean air. The self-sufficient villages meant to hold a whole gentle life. They were all, in the beginning, acts of compassion, set down in brick and stone, and every one of them was overwhelmed by too many people and too little understanding, and the simple hard truth that the world did not yet know how to help the suffering as well as it wished to. The kind ideas buckled under the weight of human need. Mistakes were made, some of them grievous, by people who, for the most part, were truly trying to help with the limited tools of their age. And then, as we learned and grew, the great institutions closed, and the world moved on, and the buildings were left behind to the weather and the trees and the gathering stories. But here is the thing worth carrying with you into sleep. All of that is over now. Completely over. Every patient who ever lay on a sunlit porch, waiting to breathe again, every troubled soul who lived out a lifetime behind those long brick walls, every forgotten person whose suitcase waited 100 years in a quiet attic, every single one of them is at rest now, finally and completely, far beyond every sorrow and every mistake and every long lonely year. There is no suffering left in any of these places. There is only memory and quiet and the slow gentle work of nature folding it all back into the earth. The moss climbing the staircase, the trees growing up through the floors, the golden grass moving in the wind on the hill, the lake keeping its long calm watch, and the stories, the ghosts, the whispers in the dark, we can set every one of them down. Now, for good. They were never anything but the natural echoes that gather in empty places, the shapes our own minds make in the silence. There is nothing waiting in any of those halls, nothing watching, nothing to fear. Only old buildings, sleeping, doing no harm to anyone, holding the long soft memory of all the people who once filled them with their lives. So let those buildings sleep now, all of them, scattered across the world beneath the same wide turning sky. And let yourself sleep too. You've wandered far enough tonight. There is nothing left to do, nowhere left to go, nothing at all that needs your attention. The places are at peace. The people are at peace. And you can be at peace as well, here, warm and safe, and still, as the night closes softly and completely over everything we visited. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift loose and quiet. Let the whole world, and all its old, sorrowful, beautiful places, fade gently into the dark. Rest now. You're safe. Everything is quiet. Everything is at peace. Good night.